Have you ever felt like no matter how much you read, you still feel behind? Or have you ever finished an article and realized you understood the content but had no idea how to integrate it into your own argument? Hey, co-authors. In this episode, we explore one of the biggest hidden shifts in writing, learning to read like a researcher instead of a student. We unpack why many scholars drown in reading and detail how researchers read to extract the rhetorical, methodological, and conceptual decisions that make scholarship work. So let's dive in. So if you're in graduate school now, or if you, like me, think back far too many years at this point into our graduate school experiences, you'll remember just how much reading went on in our programs. Whether at the master's or the doctoral level, it always seemed like professors really didn't have a sense of how much their colleagues were assigning us to read. Each one of them thought that they were the most important person in your life, and so they would give you 3, 4, 5, 6 articles a week per class, or they give you a book to read every week or every 2 weeks. Just an awful lot of reading. And of course, one of the good things about this is that if you're able to manage this load, you're able to come away with a very broad engagement with your field of study, and you get to figure out where you fit in your discipline, and then either find the people who are interested in the same types of questions that you are, whether that's people in your department, other students, other faculty, or the readings that they're assigning you, or you figure out how the things that people are doing outside of the areas that interest you can still influence or connect with or otherwise inform the types of work that you want to do for the rest of your life. But of course, on the other hand, one of the drawbacks of this is that in order for us to manage this huge load of reading, and there's a lot of traps that we all fall into that end up not serving us well for the rest of our careers. For many of us, that becomes a lot of selective reading. So we end up reading the things that only matter to us, and we never really connect with things that are beyond our immediate fascination. And as a result, we lose out on making those broader connections that might have pushed our thinking in new or creative ways. Many of us get stressed out, and it ends up being a huge mental toll because we think that we need to read every word of everything that we were assigned. And then whenever we don't do that, then we feel like failures and we burn out. And even under the best of circumstances, your professors are feeding you a great deal of information. But unless you're being very cognizant of how you're building your own voice and your own scholarship, it can really start to get to the point to where you don't really know how to find, vet, and utilize all of this information because someone else is always doing that work for you. They're the ones finding it. They're the ones assigning it. They're the ones testing you on it. And so you never really get a chance of finding your own voice. And so all this wrapped up together can put us in a space where either you are currently a student in the way that you read because you're a graduate student, whether a master's or a PhD student, or you've never gone beyond that type of thinking and that type of engagement with your reading. And so you still read like a student instead of reading like a researcher. And so that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about how researchers extract meaning from the things that they read, how they integrate those in a way that makes sense for their writing, and how to read in a effective and efficient way. So that way the work that you're doing enhances your voice and enhances your project rather than sending you off on wild goose chases. Okay, so let's dive in. Are you interested in mastering scholarly writing, developing productivity, and increasing impact, all while staying healthy? Then welcome to the Publishing Academic Research Podcast. My name is Dr. Kyle Ruddick, and I'm a full professor and writing coach who's dedicated to making sure you break through whatever is stopping you from reaching your scholarly goals. I meet so many scholars who have creative, innovative, and daring ideas, but can never seem to get those projects from proposals to print. I want you to get your work in the hands of people who will read it and appreciate it. So let's get into this week's big idea. So to start off with, I want to talk about sort of the overall problem or issue that really animates this. And I think a lot of this is because even for the nerdiest among us, as we grew up and many of us had an affinity for reading. Certainly myself, my mom is a public school teacher. And so from a very early age, I always loved to read. And if you would ask me, what is it that I like to read? I would say, unless it's got dragons or spaceships, I probably am not reading it. I do not have very refined tastes in reading. I'm not reading high literature, but man, I love myself a good fantasy book or a good sci-fi novel. But if you're like me and you started even from a very early age, liking to read or even loving to read, you read books, right? And how does one read a book? Well, you read it from start to finish. You start at page 1, you go all the way to the end. You would never start at the end. You would never read an abstract of the plot of the book. You might read the back cover of the book, but even then, right, that's not going to tell you how the book ends. And so for many of us, our earliest approaches to reading, especially deep reading, have been a linear and step-by-step process that takes us from the beginning to the end. As a result, then, whenever we try to use those exact same skills, whenever it comes to reading scholarly materials, that can get us into a lot of trouble because a lot of the way that writing is set up in academia, the most important things are towards the end, but they don't necessarily require us to have an intimate knowledge of the literature review, for example, in order for us to make some sense of the findings and the conclusion. Unlike, a book where if you were to read the last 20 pages of any book, you probably wouldn't have any idea who the characters are, what their motivations were, what the resolution meant, any of those things, because you would have missed out on all that background from the beginning. In scholarly writing, that's not the way that things proceed. And so as a result, we approach things step by step. We start at the beginning, we go to the end. And by the time that we get to what is in fact the most important part, which is the findings and conclusion, the most important part, which is the part that the author has actually contributed to our scholarship, that's the new knowledge that's been created. By then we're tired, we're cranky, we're a little bit hungry, we're running low on our cognitive reserves. And so for a lot of us, the way that we've been taught to read is not conducive to the way that we are meant to read in academia. So what I would say is that if this is the way that you've approached your reading in the past, this is not going to serve you well. And in particular, what I think that you're going to find is that if you're always reading in this very linear start to finish fashion and you're not really honing the skills of what's important out of an article and how does it connect with the things that I'm doing and how do I make this work for me, then you're always going to be in a place where you are reading to learn. And of course, learning's not bad. We're curious people. We all want more knowledge. That's why we are in graduate school. That's why we became professors. That's why we're in academia, is because we have this thirst for knowledge. But your job is not to learn things, especially if you're a professor. Your job is not to just know more things. Your job is to contribute to knowledge through your research or to disseminate knowledge through your teaching. You're not being paid just to learn things. And so it's important then that you start to read more like a researcher and you're reading through a lens of how does this reading help develop your contribution. So what are the markers that I usually see with this sort of problem? Well, I have 4 different ways that I usually see the problem of reading literature manifest for most people. So first off, whenever I'm teaching students or clients or other folks to read, the things that I typically see first are an inability to discern what are the most important parts out of any type of literature or reading. And so sometimes that's, especially with master's students or even PhD students, that might be scholar has a hard time even understanding what the author says. This can be particularly true whenever authors are using very dense or esoteric language. There are readings that I look back to in my graduate school and I'm just like, oh yeah, those were a lot of fun. I learned a lot. That was cool. And there are some that I was like, man, I would probably rather put red hot pokers in my eyes than have to read that person's prose again. My God, what an absolute slog. But whenever I'm talking with folks, whenever I'm talking with novice writers, a lot of them have problems even discerning what the author is trying to say, what they're trying to do, what they're trying to accomplish, and they just kind of take on face value everything that's going on in an article or in a piece of research or in a piece of scholarship, and they don't really see it connecting into a big whole. Instead, they hit a certain word or a certain sentence or an idea, and their cognitive function just pretty much shuts down at that point because they're like, well, I don't understand this, so I can't get past it. I can't move past that in my reading. The second way that I see this is whenever novice scholars, whenever they cite things out of the literature review that are themselves citations from something else. So you read this piece and they've cited a different scholar and you're like, oh, wow, that's a really cool quote. That's a really cool idea. I'm just going to go ahead and throw that in my paper. And so instead of doing the work of finding the original source and reading it, which is what you should do, or at the very least in your citations, saying scholar X as cited in scholar Y. So that way, as a reader, I know that you didn't actually read the original piece of the literature. What you read was someone else citing it. Instead, they just take it and chuck it into their own paper as if that's just fine. Well, obviously, A, that's not good because that's a form of plagiarism because you are citing someone else's summary, which means that you don't have direct contact with the original source. And so you're basically stealing someone else's idea because it's someone else's paraphrase or summarization of that idea. But B, it also creates the problem where you might end up getting a game of telephone where you're really relying on that person to have gotten it right. And if they didn't report those things correctly, well, now there's errors in your paper, and those errors get replicated by other people who didn't pay attention. And then after a while, all we're doing is citing erroneous scholarship. Obviously, another thing that we don't want to be doing. And so, but whenever I see, again, novice scholars, they don't really know what's important out of an article. They're just like, oh, this is a cool thing. I feel like this is going to be helpful for me. Let me just copy and paste that into my own paper without really attribution and not really understanding how that piece of literature made its way into the article that they found it in the first place. The third thing that I see, and this happens often whenever I'm talking with students who are working on their theses or their dissertations, is that because they themselves don't have a strong idea of what they want that research project to look like yet, it's very hard for them to discern what's actually important out of an article or out of a piece of scholarship. And more importantly, how to understand what's important across multiple pieces of scholarship and being able to divine what's really going to help focus and support their own argument, but instead they see everything as being equally important throughout the piece of scholarship. So they're just as likely to start taking things from the literature review as the results, as the method, as the conclusion. And sometimes I'll even have folks who will cite things out of the abstract because to them it's all a journal article. It's all the same thing. It all has equal weight. And so not having a strong research purpose and not having a strong idea of what it is that you want to write about makes it harder then for you to create a strong criteria by which you're able to discern what should or should not be read and what should or should not make it into your own work. And I think that to me sort of sums up what I would consider to be the final problem, which is that whenever novice researchers are reading work to integrate into their own scholarship, a lot of them have this idea, and I think, again, this is particularly true of grad students, which is they read in such a way as like, I have to get through this, right? I've got a mountain of reading that I got to get through. I have to slog through all of the work. In fact, I mean, I think I even said the word slog through all this work when at the beginning of this podcast, but we frame this process as getting through something rather than I'm trying to make a contribution. And how is it that this other work is helping me get to the thing that I'm interested in? And so a lot of that comes, I think, from graduate school where we were given so much work to read, of which maybe 10 or 20% is actually our core content area. And then the other 80%, it was some level of, I can make an argument for how it connects, or it doesn't connect at all, but I have to read it anyway because my professor wants me to, in which case then my reading habits from there on out kind of have this idea of like, oh man, reading's such a slog. I've got so much reading to do. Oh, I don't want to do this reading. Instead of it being, how do I have a purpose for each thing that I read? And how am I making sure that that purpose is being extracted from every article, every project, every idea that I come in contact with in a way that helps me articulate my own in a better way. What's our solution then? Well, I think that some of this is a matter of skill, that we need to be able to identify what's important out of articles and being able to drill down into those things. But part of it too is just a reorientation to how we approach our reading. If reading is a slog, then no amount of skills are going to help you, because you are always going to approach this project with dread and trepidation. Instead, what I want you to do is think about, what is it that you're passionate about? What is it that you're curious about? What's the thing that's really sparking or animating this project for you? And then how are you finding opportunities to have conversations with other people that are interested in the same things that you are through these readings? And I think that if you approach it with this other type of ethic, I think that things are going to open up for you. So what are some ways that you can do that? So I would say there are two approaches that you need to deploy whenever you are doing your reading. One is, how do I read a specific artifact, whether that's an article, book chapter, whatever it is. And second, how do I read across all of those things? So let's start with, how do I read a singular artifact? Well, first off, I would say that what you really need to be thinking about is 4 different core components of that project. First, what is the problem? What's the big picture issue, phenomena, problem, exigency? What is it that they're trying to address? And we've talked about this a little bit before. This is the diamond, right? This is the big picture thing that they're trying to address. But I think it's important to recognize that what you're trying to get at here is you're trying to find like-minded people. You're trying to find that other people are as passionate and as interested and as curious as you are about whatever the problem it is that you are interested in. Because I think that gives you a different sort of buy-in to this whole process. Instead of approaching this as, oh my God, I got to read this person, or oh my gosh, I've got to read this book that's so long. Instead, it's, I get the opportunity to connect with someone about an issue that we both get to geek out about, to share through this message in a bottle that we've thrown each other across time about this issue. And I just think that reframing even from that first step, I think, is a very important part. The second thing that you're looking for is the gap. And again, we've talked about this. This is the specific facet of the diamond that you're interested in. So whenever you are drilling down into the specific issue that you're trying to deal with, you're looking across the readings that you have and thinking to yourself, what gaps are they addressing? Are they the gaps that I'm interested in? And the reason that you're doing this is, A, as you might imagine, whenever you start reading across articles, which we'll talk about here in a second, this is where you start to figure out where the gap is that you want to address. But more than that, it's important for you to get a sense of what people thought were problems, what they currently still think of as problems, what are the things that they think might be problems in the future, or that they thought might be a problem in the future. You're getting a sense of these authors as people, because the problem, the big picture exigency, that's probably something that everyone can agree on as being a problem. But the specific entrance into that problem, how we defined the problem, what our solutions were, foreclosing one set of possibilities over another set of possibilities, all of those are choices made by authors, made by scholars. And those choices have consequences for our scholarly trajectory. And so here you're really getting to know the people of your field and of your discipline as people, because every choice that they made is a reflection on them. Every methodological choice, theoretical choice, philosophical choice, every time that every one of those is a time whenever they chose to go one direction rather than another. That reveals something about them, and it makes them human and interesting to engage with. The third thing that you're looking at is the method, because it really doesn't matter what they say that they found. If their method wasn't rigorous, then they didn't find anything, right? That's the whole point of research, is that we utilize some sort of methodological process. And through that, we either create generalizability, reliability, and validity if you're doing social science or naturalistic science, those sorts of things, or you're developing verisimilitude, credibility, and thick description if you're doing like qualitative work. But whatever types of criteria that is that you're using, there are standards that separate the practice of research from the practice of guessing or magic or gut feeling or intuition. The reason that we call it research is because of method. That's the thing that separates it from anything else. And so as you're reading the methodological choices that people are making, again, those choices matter to us, because their choices might be that they're doing less rigorous designs, or maybe they didn't account for something properly, or maybe their sample wasn't rigorously drawn, whatever it might be. But that method tells us, again, something about who it is that we're talking to. A person who continuously engages in convenience samples of college first-year students in a self-report survey of first-year general education classes, a person who that's the be-all, end-all of their methodological rigor as it pertains to sampling, that's a joke, right? That is a research design that reflects poorly on that person if that's what they did over the course of their entire career. Not saying that you should never do it, but there's definitely the old joke that we know more about college enrolled 18 to 20-year-olds than we do about any other group of people on the planet. And the reason for that is because it's convenient, but it's also, it's barely defensible most of the time as a research practice. Finally, you're reading to know what the project's contribution actually is, because it's only in knowing what the actual problem is and the gap. Because once we know what's the problem and the gap, and we know that the method tells us that what it is that we found is actually research, then we can read that contribution with a sound mind that it's actually adding to our knowledge. And as you're reading that contribution, you are looking for how does it contribute both to our theoretical knowledge? How does it help us know more about the problem in general? How does it help us develop our scholarship on this problem? How does it give us better tools for knowing, understanding, and hopefully intervening into that problem? And then what are its pragmatic takeaways? What is it that we're actually supposed to do with this scholarship? How is it supposed to inform our practice? How are we supposed to do things differently based on the things that you've found? Now, I've talked about those things as problem, gap, method, contribution, and the discerning reader might say, well, hey, but I thought that you said that we shouldn't be reading projects from start to finish. You're absolutely right. What I would say is that it's important for you to read the introduction to an article. That is the first section of the article before you actually get into the literature review, because that's usually where you find the problem and the gap. Then you read the method. So you skip over the bulk of the literature review, read the method section, and then you read the contribution. Some people will say, well, you start with the contribution first. Some people start with the method first. I would say this actual specifics of which way that you read your article is in many ways less important than for you to start developing what approach works best for you and how do you read in a way that is both effective and efficient. So if that's intro, method, contribution, like I've talked about, or if that's some other way, have at it. What you don't want to do is read verbatim, word for word, from start to finish, every article that you come across. That is going to end up being an incredible waste of your time, because most of the stuff that is not even going to be pertinent for you, especially in the literature review, because they were reading the findings and the conclusions of other people in order for them to support the type of project that they were doing that created their hypothesis or research question or research purpose. Well, yours is going to be different from theirs. So you're not going to be able to have a one-to-one analogous literature review. Instead, you need to do the work of reading people's findings and conclusions in order to know how it pertains to your particular project. So once you've gotten good at reading a singular thing, it's time for you to read across multiple artifacts. So what I would say is that there are 4 different ways that you might track patterns across the things that you're reading. So as you're reading, you're going to want to make notes to yourself of the things that you're seeing, not just within an article, but across articles. So first off are recurring themes. This might be methodological, theoretical, conceptual, philosophical. But if, for example, you find that every time that people talk about hunger as a social ill that we need to address, and the bulk of the literature talks about market solutions for addressing hunger. Well, that ends up being a philosophical and moral framework for understanding hunger. Hunger is a function of not having enough money, not working hard enough, not having an entrepreneurial spirit, whatever it might be. Then if you want to write in that vein, you go, I'm going to contribute to this. Here's other marketplace reforms that might be good for addressing hunger. Or you say, actually, hunger is not a market-based problem. It's a political problem. And that political question is one that needs to be addressed before we think about markets. So it's not a matter of scarcity of resources, it's a matter of choices that have been made at the nation state or global level that keep people hungry. Now we've started to identify trends and themes across these things, and we can make choices to either agree with those trends and to write in that vein, or to disagree with those trends, mark those trends, and then chart a different path. You can look for contradictions. So if you find contradictory findings, if you have contradictory frameworks that have been used on the same problem, then that would allow you to the gaps in the literature as they relate to a disagreement across multiple outlets. You might think of missing populations. Again, we know a whole lot about 18 to 20-year-old college students and how they respond, for example, to sexual health education campaigns, because a whole lot of our efforts have been to teach young people in particular how to have sex safely. Another population that emerging research is showing us that we need to have much more of an attention on is older populations as it relates to sexual health. And yet for the longest time, this was a missing population. We spent almost all of our time focusing on this 15 to 25-year-old population. And so as we're realizing now that sex is something that is a part of humans' experiences across their lifespan, that has forced all sorts of conversations among health experts and others to address this issue. So again, missing populations can be important. Finally, you should look at the future research directions, because for a lot of authors, especially if they're writing articles, it's very common for them to write about what they think the next steps of research should be. Sometimes those are very on point and can be a place where if you see agreement across multiple outlets about what we should be doing next in our research, you can use that as justification for your own project, which is great because those past authors have literally given you the space to address and research the thing that you're passionate about. On the other hand, sometimes those things can be a lot of fun because they're like laughably wrong in their prognostication of what they think is going to happen. You look at the stuff in like the early 2000s and what they thought the role of the internet was going to be with education, and how, by this time, everyone was going to be in these massive online only classes and no one was really going to pay for education and everything was going to be digital and no one was ever going to want to step foot on a college campus ever again. And you're like, okay, well, here we are. And obviously things have changed, but they're also kind of the same. And so the idea that singular technology was going to like absolutely upend centuries of investment and culture in higher education, you look at that and you're like, okay, well, maybe not so much. But those times whenever people get it wrong, again, can be very interesting because that can provide you an opportunity to say, hey, look, we thought that things were going to go this way. They haven't, or they've even gone the opposite direction. That's why it's more important now than ever that we start to address the area that you as the writer want to address. Overall, what I would say is that I think for a lot of folks, they get a little bit burned out on all of the reading that they have to do in grad school, and that sets them up with some very bad patterns for the rest of their career. But reading like a researcher, it's not about reading more. It's about learning to read in a way that's different than what you've probably been reading up into this point in your life. You're not reading things in a sequential point A to point B fashion. Instead, you're looking for these content shifts, these moves that are happening through the article or through the book or the chapter, whatever it is that you're reading, and you're trying to hone in on the stuff actually going to support the project that you are trying to articulate and the purpose that you have for that project. What I would say is that if you're really interested in developing your reading skills, if you have a faculty member who's willing to do this for you, I would encourage you to read an article, make notes to yourself about what you think the most important parts of that article are and how it relates to your particular area that you want to study, and then chat with them and see, hey, this is what I would really like to do with my time. This is the type of research that I would like to do. Here's this article that I read. Here's how I think it connects to the things that I want to do. Do you think that I'm getting the most out of this article? Do you think that I'm getting the right things out of this article? And really work with them to develop this competency, because the ability to read effectively and efficiently for your work is going to be an indispensable skill for the rest of your time. And if you feel like you don't have a faculty member to do that with, you can always reach out to me. My contact information is in the podcast description. Always happy to chat about articles. And even if I'm not in your content area, I think just the ability for you to work on how to best communicate the stuff that you're interested in, you being able to do that in a succinct and powerful fashion, even for someone who doesn't have the same background as you, that should force you to engage with that work in a way that makes you more precise, because then you're having to do more translational work for an outside reader or for an outside listener. Okay, so that's going to about wrap it up for me, folks. As always, I appreciate you listening. If you didn't get a chance to, I would really encourage you to listen to last week's episode. Stanford professor Jack Baker was my interviewee. He just came out with his new book, Communication by Design, An Engineer's Guide to Sharing Your Research. It's a great book. I had so much fun talking with him, and I really think that folks are going to learn a lot to both write and present their research. If you're interested in being on this podcast, by all means, reach out to me. My contact information is in the podcast description. It's always interesting to me to meet new people. I'm hoping to have on more guests as we go forward. So if you or someone that you know might want to be on the podcast, have them get in touch with me. I'm happy to talk with them about it and see if it's a good fit, because ultimately I want to make sure that the people that I have on this podcast are folks that you all are going to want to listen to, that have good ideas that you can use in your life, and that the things that they have to say are the things that are going to help you write the things that you're passionate about and get that work into the hands of the people who are going to read it and cite it and love it. Okay? So thank you so much, and I'll see you in next week's episode. Hey, co-authors. What's stopping your best ideas from becoming your next big publication? Brilliant research shouldn't die in your drafts folder. Now's the time to bridge the gap between the possible and the published. You can support this podcast by subscribing to it, leaving a positive review, assigning it to your classes, or sharing it with a colleague. Let me know what I can do to make this the best podcast resource for you. And if you'd like to know more about my writing coach services, then you can find my information in the podcast description and set up an appointment. I'll be back next week with another episode. But until then, keep healthy, keep writing, and don't let reviewer 2 get you down.